Hello everyone, welcome back to Film Flicks. Today's video is about a very interesting comedy and romance movie titled The Late Bloomer, which was released in 2016. The movie tells a story about a 30-year-old man who just gotten his puberty due to a tumor in his brain, and it completely changes his life and relationships. Well, without further ado, let's get started. The movie starts with a scene of our protagonist, Peter Newmans, in a therapy session with one of his clients. He diagnoses her with obsessive sexual desires, and tells her to read his book so she can channel her sexual energy into something productive. Peter is a psychiatric therapist who specializes in sex addiction therapy. We see him going about his daily routine, always recording new ideas for his next book on his recorder no matter what he's doing, even in the toilet. When he gets home from work, he is greeted by a teenage boy named Josh, who is one of his neighbors. The teen tells him about his date that went sideways. Peter then enters his apartment, where his two friends, Rich and Luke, are already sitting on his couch while watching a movie. Peter complains about them using an emergency key to get into his apartment while he's away, but Rich argues that this is an emergency because he needs time away from his kids. Luke's excuse is that her ex-girlfriend is at his place picking up her stuff. Peter asks if he's feeling okay after the breakup, but Luke is actually fine and is even using a dating app to find girls. He tells Peter to sign up on the dating app too, but Peter avoids the topic. Peter then excuses himself to go to Michelle's place for a dinner party. We see Peter greeted at the door by Michelle's roommate Nikki, then he comes in and greets Michelle's boyfriend, Charlie, who is watching a match on his phone. We finally see Michelle, Peter's friend and neighbor, who is cooking and tells Peter to try some. It is clear that Peter has a crush on her. He tells her to open a restaurant, but she says she isn't ready yet. They joke around and toast a glass of wine each, but then Peter suddenly gets a headache that he brushes off. The next day, Peter stops by at his parents' house. His hippie mom, Brenda, gives him a tin of brownies and asks him about his job. Meanwhile, his dad, James, gives some snide remarks about Peter's job, saying that he's repressing people's natural needs. After Peter leaves, Brenda complains about James' negativity, but James just doesn't understand Peter because he's never had a girlfriend and yet he's an expert in sex therapy. Peter goes to his clinic to receive some good news from his boss, Caroline. She tells her that he is accepted to give a talk about his book at a prestigious event, and that he will be interviewed by someone famous. They both get excited by the opportunity. The next scene shows us Charlie storming off in the apartment hallway complaining about Michelle. Peter knocks on her door and gives her a hug. They drink wine and talk about Michelle's relationship with Charlie and how she wants to end it. Peter consoles Michelle, and she finally decides to become a chef. She thanks Peter and hugs her, but suddenly they kiss. Michelle backs away, saying that she's sorry, but Peter stands up and says that he needs to go because of his headache and that he'll call her later. We see Peter in his apartment, wallowing and asking himself what is wrong with him. In the morning, Luke and Rich wakes Peter up to play basketball. The doorbell rings, it's Michelle. She wants to say thank you and apologize for kissing Peter last night. Peter says that he's there for her and gives her a friendly hug. On the way to basketball, Peter's friends wonder why he doesn't respond to Michelle romantically even though he likes her. But Peter says that she needed genuine kindness last night and that pursuing her right after a breakup would be taking advantage of her. They then play with 3 other guys when Peter gets hit on his crotch by a basketball. He passes out and gets taken to a hospital, where we find out that his lower region isn't developed like a normal adult male. The doctor orders him to get a CAT scan and an MRI. The result says that Peter has a brain tumor. The tumor has been there for a long time, pushing on his pituitary gland and causing his body to produce female hormones, and that's why Peter hasn't experienced puberty yet. Peter is overjoyed to hear that he's actually a normal guy and not a freak. They then schedule the surgery to remove his tumor. The surgery was a success. The doctor tells Peter that the change will come gradually. He stays at his parents' house while he recovers, waiting for his puberty to come. When Rich and Luke comes by, Peter tells him that he feels the same as before and that he's afraid the surgery won't change anything. They tell him not to worry, and apparently brought Peter a hooker to help stimulate his puberty to come. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. Later that night he gets a text from Michelle asking where he's gone to. Peter replies that it's a family emergency, not telling her the truth. After a couple of days, finally Peter gets an erection in the morning. His parents celebrate the occasion. Peter is very happy and immediately gets out of his parents' house. On the way out, he sees the mail delivery woman looking very sexy and seductive, while actually she's just in her normal uniform doing her job. Peter gets home but finds that Luke brought a girl over to have sex. He tells them to get out, then proceeds to finally jerk off for the first time in his life. We then see a montage of him jerking off in different ways, so many times, even while ironing. During lunch with Rich and Luke, he talks about his puberty experience and they assure him that his excessive jerking off is normal. When Peter wants to go to his office, he gets stopped in the hallway by Michelle, who tells him that he's going to Santa Barbara for a week to a culinary program in hopes of becoming a chef. Peter congratulates her and gives her a hug, but then feels an erection coming, so he immediately lets go and pretends to be late for work. At the office, the same phenomenon that happened with the mail delivery woman happens again. Every woman seems so seductive when they're actually just acting normally. Then we see Peter's work as a psychiatrist being affected by his puberty. He gets horny by his patients' stories. The next day, Peter wakes up with a lot of pimples on his face, just like a teenager. When he gets out, he gets caught by Michelle and Nikki, and gets embarrassed. He goes to the hospital to visit the doctor that treated his tumor, asking for a pill to make his puberty symptoms go away. But of course there is no such thing. Next scene, we see Michelle coming over to Peter's apartment wanting to talk for a moment. She is shocked to see the messy state of his apartment, which is unlike his usual self before puberty. Michelle tells Peter that he has been acting weird since the supposed family emergency. Peter tells her that they'll talk about it after she comes back from Santa Barbara. She agrees and says goodbye with a hug. Then we see Peter playing a video game with Josh, when he gets a call from Michelle, who is in Santa Barbara. She tells him about how great the program is and how handsome and wonderful her teacher is, which makes Peter jealous. He then hangs up on her after telling her that he'll call her back tomorrow, and continues playing the game. Peter is now in a radio station, being interviewed as guest in a radio segment by the host, Noama Wilcoxon. He talks about his book and his work in sex therapy, but in the middle of it, his voice starts to crack like a teenage boy. We then see his father comforting him about it afterwards during a family meal. His parents try to make Peter feel better, but he retaliates and screams that he's a full-grown man, not a baby. He gets upset and emotional, storming out the room. Instead of being upset, his dad says he's been waiting for that moment for years. We then see Michelle calling Peter to give another update, but as she tells him about her teacher, Peter gets jealous and upset, telling her to enjoy sleeping with her teacher, then hanging up on her. On the way to another basketball game, Rich asks Peter to babysit his kids for his anniversary, which Peter agrees to. They then play basketball with the guys from the previous game, but this time Peter is acting more aggressively, unlike in the past. Everyone tells Peter to calm down after he becomes too angry. When he comes back to the apartment, Josh tells him that he smells really bad. They then try to see which body spray suits Peter the most. During dinner they talk about how Peter have this possessive urge towards Michelle and it's driving him crazy. Josh talks about how many intimate partners Michelle probably had in her life, and then suggests that Peter use a dating app to get the necessary experience to please her. We see a montage of Peter using the dating app and having sex with many girls in different situations. When Peter comes back to the apartment, he sees Richard knocking on Michelle's door with a bouquet of flowers. Peter tells him that she's still out of town, and Richard tries to get information about Michelle from Peter, saying that he messed up and that he misses her. He asks Peter to tell her about his flowers, and Peter agrees. When Michelle comes back, she thinks that the flowers were from Peter because Richard didn't sign the card. Instead of telling the truth, Peter just accepts it and comes to her apartment. He then finally asks Michelle out for dinner that night, and she says yes. When he's getting ready, Rich calls to remind him that he needs to babysit Rich's kids. They get into an argument, and eventually Peter refuses. Before Peter leaves for the date, Josh gives him an advice to not be nice to Michelle because he thinks that girls don't like nice guys. During the dinner, Peter is acting sleazy and unlike himself, following Josh's advice. Michelle gets annoyed and asks why Peter is being rude. He says sorry and tells her that he's actually just nervous and that he's wanted to go on this date for a very long time. Michelle reassures him that he shouldn't be nervous. When Peter is about to tell her what happened to him, Rich and his wife suddenly comes in and says that Peter stole their table at the restaurant, and that he's being a bad friend for bailing on babysitting their kids. Peter and Michelle leaves. She is angry and doesn't understand why Peter is not acting like his old self. Peter asks for another chance, but she says that he sounds like Charlie now, and tells him that she knows the flowers were from Charlie. Michelle storms off and Peter also gets upset, yelling at her to go back to Charlie. The next day, Peter is working with a patient that is addicted to sex. We then see his boss coming in his office to ask something when she witnesses Peter trying to open his pants to have sex with the patient. He gets scolded by her, saying that their reputation will be destroyed and the patient can sue them for his actions. Feeling lost, Peter comes to his parents' house and drinks beer with his dad. They talk about his puberty. Peter complains about it, but his dad consoles him, saying that it's normal for most guys. He proceeds to tell her a story about when he and Peter's mom had a fight, and that the most important thing is how they fix their mistakes, and how to act like a man instead of just being a man. He also says that he's never embarrassed of Peter and that he's always loved him. He tells Peter to tell Michelle the truth and fix his mistakes. Peter finally gives a talk about his book at the prestigious event, but in the middle of it, he completely scraps the talk and says that his theories in his book is wrong because he had been avoiding sex for 15 years. He instead tells the audience that sex is a wonderful and beautiful thing, and that they should all have sex. After the event, Peter goes to Rich's house to apologize to him and his wife about what happened. They accept the apology, and then talk about how Michelle is now back with Richard. Rich's wife suggests that Peter go to her restaurant's opening night to fix his mistakes. During opening night, Peter, Rich, and Luke comes into the restaurant, blasting romantic music to get Michelle's attention. She gets pissed off at him, saying that what he's doing is just about him when Peter says he wants to apologize. Peter says she's moving backwards by returning to Richard, when Richard comes to them to see if there's a problem. When Peter tries to walk away, Rich tells him to go back and tell her everything, so Peter shouts out loud that he has never had puberty before at 30 years old. Everyone in the restaurant can hear him, including Michelle. Peter elaborates what has happened to him, and then asks Michelle for another chance. Michelle then breaks up with Richard, and decides to give Peter another chance. They finally kiss and everyone in the restaurant cheer for them. In the closing scene of the movie, we see that Peter is doing a book signing event for his new book about being a man. We also see that Michelle is now pregnant with their child. Peter is now finally a normal adult guy with Michelle as his wife, just like he always wanted. That is the end of today's video. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button, and tell us what movie to recap next in the comments. See ya.